Ben Kattchor is the award-winning cartoonist, perhaps best known for Julius Knipple, real estate photographer, but also the author of many other books of cartoons, including the new one, Hand Drawing in America. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
How is it that cartooning, which when I was growing up, it was Superman and so on, how has it become an art form that can be used in a serious attempt to serve grown-up issues? And
Well, when I was going to school, there was, all through my childhood, for people of a certain generation and for educational institutions like publishers and schools, there was a really strong prejudice against the form because it was associated with sort of low brow and low economic publishing for comic books, superhero comic books, the comic books from 39 on. So it wasn't taken, you couldn't talk about it in school. I could study writing and I could study painting, but the idea of mixing these two disciplines together was not something you could talk about. And when I finished school, I studied both of those two pure disciplines. I had this childhood memory of comics because I grew up looking. Everybody did, and it's more in the realm of theater. It's this multimedia thing. The actor comes out on a stage and talks, and it's the most natural thing. It predates the purity of those forms. So theater goes back to the ancient world. And the story of how these other disciplines became purified so that comics could not be seen as a serious form is a long, complicated history. But in the 70s, quite a few people started looking at this, and there was this underground comics thing happened in the 60s, and in the 70s, a lot of people were looking back at that form and saying, what is this stigma? Why aren't we able to talk about this form? It's the form that was, and it's the perfect form to talk about all of these, anything you'd want to write about, from fiction to reportage, to speculative fiction, because it plays that full gamut from the conventions of language to the particularities of the image. So it's,
of course, Will Eisner pioneered the graphic novel. What earlier cartoonist most influenced you?
Well, that's a complicated question because there was the reading of comics as a child, and I grew up reading Dick Tracy and Little Orphan Annie. Those things were still in the papers. I can't say I aspired to do strips like that. I think it was more that moment in the 60s, and I saw Robert Crumb and Bill Griffith, and I said, these are people doing work for adult readers. And I said, this is Edward Gorey, he's a picture book writer.
Yeah.
You'd see these examples, and it seemed like it's a viable thing to do. It was not easy. We would never be at a book festival in 1970. It was like you're doing the wrong thing. So.
Tell me about Hand Drawing in America.
That's a collection of several, over 100 short stories that were done in comic strip form for an architecture magazine called Metropolis that I work for. I do a strip every month. And they're my take on the built world as a user, as a lot of speculation upon why the world is, the way it is, why we're sitting in chairs rather than on the floor, like we might be in another culture. And all these kind of basic research questions into the built world.
your cartoons have been called picture poems.
Well, comic strips, at least the kind I do, they're short and very concise. And that way they have the compression of poetry rather than prose fiction. And they have this other layer of image happening, so they're they're layered like some poems are. There's the kind of, but you know, you have to, yeah, if you read them, you might see why they're, it's hard to, but I think it has a lot to do with that concision and use of language. I mean, you know, you have to really consider the words you have, because it is I work in this short form.
I hate to ask this question. I usually try to avoid it at all costs, but but with you, I'm going to have to. Where do you get your ideas for something like Julius?
I've always worked for serial publication in magazines and newspapers, and so there's this thing called a deadline, which is the mother of invention, and it's like a public utility, like, you know, do you have to have inspiration to make electric work? Not every day, but Edison and these early inventors were very inspired. So this is done as a utility, as a public utility. I have to come up with a strip, and I can light upon any object in the built world and then interrogate it and come up with a good story. I mean, some are more inspired than others, but I can come up with a pretty good story about anything, and that's that's really how I approach it.
The beauty supply district, the cardboard valise.
Yeah.
These are almost like existential portrayals of ordinary lives.
Yeah, those are collections of weekly strips that have the form of when you look at them in the aggregate, they have the form of a novel, like a very rambling, strange novel that doesn't follow a strict linear narration. And the cardboard valise is a travelogue about visiting imaginary places. It's about a man who hates his own culture and just has to get out of it. He has to. Anywhere else is bearable. His own culture just suffocates him. And it's just a story about where that leads him. And the Beauty Supply District was part of the Knipple series, and it was a neighborhood I imagine that dealt with aesthetic questions. So you could go there, artists could go there if they had some problem, and sort of pay someone to help them work out the aesthetics of their painting or their musical composition. That's a long story at the end of a collection of Knipple stories. It's not a novel length. It's story.
You know, it seems to me that graphic art, graphic novels, cartooning is becoming ever more important part of our culture. Accepted as art, accepted as entertainment on level with other forms, fine art, film, literature. Do you see that continuing?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's a medium. It's an ancient idea, mixing text and image. So it manifests itself in theater and in video and in film. Comics is a particular version of that that uses handmade images. So it has a graphic print quality as opposed to live actors. So yeah, it's been around, and people are inventing other ways other kinds of stories, less linear stories, interactive stories. But no, it's an ancient form, and You know, it's the first few decades where it's being looked at as a legitimate form. I mean, what you do in it is up to you. It's not a making, and it's the same danger as all legitimized forms. Once everyone says poetry is a serious kind of literary form, you're going to get a million terrible poets because it's something you can go to school and study, and it's an approved form of expression. If you say I'm going to, you know, roll meatballs across the floor as my art, for people might say, I don't know where that fits. Is that sculpture? What are you trying to do? Is that theater? So these forms, once they're accepted, they're taught in schools, and the kind of necessity to prove itself as a form is gone. You don't have to prove that great comics can be made. They have been made. You know, crazy. They were made a long time before the modern graphic novel moment in publishing. So it's a matter of making great work in the form. It's not just the form. The form will be there. You know.
Ben Kattchor, his new book is Hand Drying in America. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Great to be here.